Hello listeners, in this video let's discuss about A Vindication of the Rights of Women written by Mary Wollstonecraft. Let's see about the author. Mary Wollstonecraft is born in the year 1759. She died in the year 1797. She was an English writer, philosopher and advocate of women's rights. Her work, A Vindication of the Rights of Women, is a dedication to M. Talleyrand Petrigord. He is a French politician who published a pamphlet titled Rapport sur Instruction Publique in 1791. In the pamphlet, he had recommended public education for men because men move around the world. But for women, he emphasizes to have private education because women live more secluded lives. Reading his pamphlet, Wollstonecraft quickly moved to respond. She grounds her rebuttal on the claim that only free people can be virtuous citizens, and she says that freedom can be only achieved by means of education. By her work, A Vindication of the Rights of Women, she decides to induce him to reconsider the subject of women's rights and national education. She also explains that she considers independence to be the basics of every virtue. When we observe the background history, Talleyrand Petrigord, he submits his report on education to France National Assembly as a part of the process of revising the French Constitution. Now, reading this, only Wollstonecraft gets motivated to respond to the report because she believes that these recommendations on female education will be damaging to society as a whole. She thinks that if women aren't educated enough to function as equals of men, then men cannot become more knowledgeable or virtuous either. As Mary Wollstonecraft began to write, she makes references of Talleyrand Petrigord. His full name is Charles Maurice T. Talleyrand Petrigord. Next is Jean Jacques Rousseau. Next is Dr. John Gregory. Next is James Fordyce. Now let's see the characters that are involved here in her reference. First is Talleyrand Petrigord. He was a long-standing French diplomat and politician. In 1791, he submitted his rapport sur instruction publique to the French National Assembly as a part of the process of revising the French Constitution. The report addresses public education for men. It also recommends private education as sufficient for women. Let's see who is Jean Jacques Rousseau. He is a prominent Enlightenment philosopher whose writings influenced the French Revolution and had a long-standing impact on political thought in general. Also, his modern views of human nature also influences the French Revolution. More importantly, in the year 1762, he publishes a treatise named as Emily or On Education. This treatise of him shaped national education in France. So Wollstonecraft, she interacts with this throughout her work, A Vindication of the Rights of Women. Throughout the work, we can identify Wollstonecraft's criticizing Rousseau's views on women's willingness to obey others unquestioningly. Let's see about the next character, Gregory. He was a Scottish Enlightenment physician and moralist. His book, A Father's Legacy to His Daughters, written in the year 1774, was written in honor of his late wife and was only intended for family use, but his son published the work after Gregory's death and it became a bestseller in Britain and America. Wollstonecraft, after reading it, she criticizes some of Gregory's positions on women's education and women's interactions with men. Next character is James Fordyce. He was a Scottish Presbyterian minister who was popular in London in the 1760s and 1770s. He is known especially for his rhetorical skill and emphasizes on topics that are relevant to daily life. He is best known for the sermon collection published in the year 1766 as Sermons for Young Women, which Wollstonecraft she criticizes and attacks in her work A Vindication of the Rights of Women. Let's see the summary of the work A Vindication of the Rights of Women. As I already said, Mary Wollstonecraft she writes this work in response to the French politician Talleyrand Perigord's pamphlet on national education. Her argument is that if women are not prepared by education to become the companion of man, she will stop the progress of knowledge and virtue. Wollstonecraft believes that if women are neglected to do their education, then that causes great mystery. Women are taught that romance is the primary goal of their lives and they are not encouraged to develop their reason or virtue. Now, in her critique of contemporary views of women's education, Wollstonecraft looks primarily at middle class women and considers them first as human creatures who placed on this earth to unfold their faculties. She bases her argument on the belief that reason is what makes people human, that virtue is what distinguishes people from one another, and that virtue is attained through knowledge. Wollstonecraft also rejects the common argument that men and women should aim to acquire different virtues. For example, men moving around to different parts of the world and women are being secluded all alone at home. Now, having this in her mind, she believes that although men and women generally have different duties in life, they should strive for identical virtues. But because women tend to be given a haphazard education, they are not given adequate opportunity to develop their reason and attain virtue. She points that more often women are taught to please men, like preparing themselves for only a brief period of life, that is to have relationship with a man and to be ready to be married. Even in a marriage relationship, women aren't even prepared to build sustainable marriages, or they are not even able to get prepared to care for their children effectively. Because women are taught that pleasure is the overriding goal of their lives, they are never given the opportunity to struggle with a difficulty and with problem, and thereby they could not develop knowledge and virtue. And women also, instead of learning to rely on reason, they are allowed to be driven by emotions and delicate sensibilities, which do not prepare women to be good wives and mothers. This neglectful education also leaves them especially vulnerable if they get widowed or if seduced and ruined by a man. In these situations in which they are left without any means to support themselves financially. So Wollstonecraft, she specifically criticizes several 18th century writers on the subject of women's education, which those characters I have brought in character list. Among all 18th century writers, her most detailed critique is Jean Jacques Rousseau, who argues that women only need to be educated in as much as it prepares them to serve men. She also dismisses James Fortie's sentimental sermons and Gregory's rules of decorum. She concludes that women have observed many of these oppressive standards because they haven't been taught to distinguish between reason and prevailing prejudices. She also addresses the importance of childhood impressions, the necessity of modesty for both sexes, and the distinction between external reputation and virtue. Wollstonecraft especially observes the duties of women, especially the duties of motherhood and domestic life, as a virtual building block for families and thus ultimately even for society, because society pressures women to care primarily about external beauty. They have no incentive to attend to the duties that nature has given them. That leads to unhappiness and malformed family bonds. And Wollstonecraft, she strongly supports women, saying that women deserves the protection of civil laws in order to support them in fulfilling their duties. They should also have the option of studying medicine, politics, and business in order to have more occupational doors open to them. And these open doors allows them to be of greater use to the society. By this, Wollstonecraft concludes a vindication with a proposal to establish free national schools for all children, and such schools should mark strong republican that should push equality and that should also focus on creating good citizens, like nurturing the virtues that have taken root right from one's home. She also advocates co-education of every stage in one's life, believing that this will allow both the sexes to develop in more natural and healthy ways. She also mentions the importance of educating girls in schools, which will distract them from their domestic duties. Rather, it will awaken their minds and prepare them all for the betterment of their lives. And by providing education, a woman also fulfills her duties by caring for their families based on reasoning and being virtue. Finally, Wollstonecraft calls for a revolution for women by repeating again and again by saying that women's subordinate status is due to men's prejudices and not to be any inherent weaknesses. If women get free from men prejudices, they tend to develop their own understanding and affections towards their family. And by doing this, women are released from their own ignorances. Hence, they enjoy greater independence by fitting themselves with human souls, and society as a whole will only benefit. Let's see the themes that are carried in this work: education and virtue. Next is gender and marriage, the thinking ability and reasoning, and the last is women's role in society. The symbols used in this work is flowers. Mary Wollstonecraft, sometimes she uses flowers or plants to symbolize the planting, nourishing, and blooming of human virtue, or the failure to achieve the virtue by human beings. For instance, in the introductory part, she compares women to flowers. She uses this image to argue that when women minds are not properly nourished in the soil of education, then women cannot reach their full intellectual and moral potential. She then discusses about the liberty as the condition for virtue, because if women are not afforded the freedom made possible by education, then they'll not flourish in the society. She also argues that both men and women must attain education. Only then there will be a broader perspective in all cultivated activities. Hope this video helped you. If you have any suggestion for discussion, please write it on the comment section. Thank you for listening.